It's really good to be here tonight, and thank you, Tyler, for that introduction. And one thing I need to say, I've been at OC now for 4 years. I'm starting my 5th year teaching in the College of Bible. Moved here from New Jersey, and within the first year, I began to develop a list, kind of a mental list, of students that were really good, paid attention, insightful in their work, and just were all around just good people. And the more I got to know this group of students, there was one thread that kept weaving most of them together, and that was that they were from the Broken Arrow Church of Christ. And so whatever it is you all are doing here to develop really outstanding young people, I just think it's wonderful. And I just wanted to share that with you because I've been so encouraged in my teaching life at OC, just from the young people, the students that I've met that have grown up in this congregation. So I wanted to share that with you, and I really appreciate it very much. Our subject tonight in the series that you're in on the faithful is Samson. And the the title of my lesson, which you may have seen either in print or on the screen, is When God Works Through the Strong and the Clueless. Because if you've read the story of Samson, you know that he's very strong. And you probably also know that compared to lots of other characters in the Old Testament, he is not your brightest. And he is sort of not known for his stellar character. And there's just a lot of kind of odd situations that he gets into. And so it begs the question, what is it that we, as a contemporary audience, what can we get from this story that would be encouraging to our faith? We know from the Hebrew writer, for example, in the list of the faithful in Hebrews chapter 11, Samson is there. Chapter 11, starting in verse 32, as the writer goes on, he says, "And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions, quenched raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight." Right? There's a long list there that come out of the book of Judges, listed as the faithful. And so this is such an interesting story because on the surface of it, right, as we sort of read it through in the book of Judges, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot to draw on there that would sort of obviously be a story about someone we would want to be like. But yet Hebrews lists Samson as one of the faithful. And so tonight, in the few minutes that we have together, I'd like for us to go through this story of Samson to see what it is out of this story that we can gain that would be encouraging to us and to our faith. So when we look at the book of Judges, I want to do a little bit of scene setting about how the book of Judges works, because I think that would be helpful so we can locate the story of Samuel into this really extraordinary book of Israelite history. As you know, the book of Judges, the period of the Judges, precedes the period of the kings, right? So the people have been in the promised land. Joshua has died. There's a need for additional someone to lead the people. And so there are a series of judges that are raised up. And one of the thing about the judges is that they come at periods of time when Israel does the bad thing, right? That's a recurring phrase in the book of Judges. And once again, Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or Israel did the bad thing in the eyes of the Lord. And this is idolatry, right? When they decide to leave the Lord and worship idols of the nations around them. And so this is when God delivers them into the hands of their enemy. The people cry out because they're oppressed and they're miserable. God takes pity on them, and then God raises up a judge. And the Spirit of the Lord comes on to the judge. The judge delivers the people from their oppressors. And then there's sometimes a period of short peace, and then the cycle starts all over again. And in the book of Judges, as we start this story, the cycle of people doing the bad thing, being delivered into the hands of the enemies, God raising up the judge and being delivered, that cycle is pretty tight. In other words, the stories are very short. And as we go through the book, right, the stories get longer and more complicated, and the cycle gets a little bit more disjointed until finally, by the time we get to Samson, and after Samson, the book completely unravels. And the last verse in the book of Judges is one of the most chilling, I think, in all of the historical narratives, and that is that in that day in Israel there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Right? And the period of the Judges just ends in this kind of anarchy. Right? There's no form, there's no structure, everybody's doing whatever it is they want to do, and the leadership of the people of Israel has unraveled and failed completely, right, by the time we get to the end of the book. The story of Samson really is sort of one of the last stories that you have, at least in Judges as we have it in our Bibles, that's a discrete story, right? And if as you go through the story of Judges, stories in Judges, one of the things you'll notice is that they don't do a lot of judging like we would think of, right? You would kind of expect. Deborah actually comes probably fairly close because she's sitting under the palm tree and people are coming to her and she's, giving decisions, and she's kind of, sort of weighing what needs to happen in Israel. She comes pretty close. But a lot of the others, they seem more like military leaders than really anything else. And in fact, the Hebrew term that is translated Judges actually could be more properly translated, I think, as a chieftain, to where they are kind of a tribal leader, and perhaps there's some judging that goes on, but not a whole lot. And so when we get to the story of Samson in Judges chapter 13, we're at a point in the book where the leadership of Israel has already sunk to a pretty serious low. And the story starts out in chapter 13 saying that, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Right? So we're back to that starting point. And then the story of Samson runs Judges 13, 14, 15, 16. And the whole first chapter is about the way in which the mission of Samson is outlined, how he is to be raised is outlined. It's a story of both of his parents encountering an angel of the Lord. I mean, it's a big setup to get us to understand that this person of Samson is not just, some kind of random character, but that he's supposed to be an important person, right? He's a sort of a well thought out kind of judge. And I'm not going to read all of it, but just to give you a sense of his mission, in chapter 13, verse 2, it says, "There was a man from Zorah, from the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren, having borne him no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, 'Although you are barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink or eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor is to come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazirite to God from birth, meaning one who is set apart for something special. It is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like that of an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell me his name, but he said to me, you shall conceive and bear a son. So drink no wine or strong drink, eat nothing unclean, for the boy shall be a Nazirite to God from birth to the day of his death. Now, this is important because it gives us the mission, right? Samson was born and conceived with a mission, and his mission was to begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, right? But his parents were given very important instructions on how he how he should be raised, and one of those was that he was to be a Nazirite, meaning that his hair was not to be cut, and that was a sign that he was going to be set apart for something very special that the Lord had for him to do, which we know was to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. So that is kind of what we expect to be reading about for the next few chapters. But instead, even though we kind of eventually get to that, we read all kinds of intrigue about Samson, right? We read, for example, that one of the first things we know about Samson is that he's grown up, and who should he marry but a Philistine? Well, that's kind of interesting, right? Because you think, well, if your mission is to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, then you probably, do you really want to marry one? Isn't that like making an alliance with the enemy? It just seems off, right? That Samson is sort of acting contrary to the mission. And of course, there's all kinds of intrigues, with his wife, and she eventually winds up, not in a good place, and there's a skirmish with the Philistines, and no sooner is that over, but that we find out that he actually, is using his strength to kill animals and all this other kind of stuff, and he has a weakness for various women. He visits prostitutes from time to time. We read about that. And, the more we start knowing about Samson, the more we're thinking, wait a minute, this doesn't really sound like the way someone should be acting who is called by God to deliver the enemies, right? Because Samson's pretty much going off and using this amazing strength that God has given him for purposes that just don't seem consistent with his mission necessarily. And then finally, one of the things that we learn in chapter 16 is that he forms an alliance with this famous woman. We know her by the name of Delilah, right? And so Delilah's job is to find out, and she has an alliance, with the Philistines. Her job is to find out the source of Samson's strength. And so she goes in to try to figure out what it is, and he actually lies to her a few times about it. And we know from other parts of the story that his weakness with women is that he can be worn down, right? If he's nagged enough, then eventually at the end he'll go, okay, I'll tell you what it really is, right? So he finally tells her the secret is in, he's a Nazirite. The secret is with the hair, right? And so the story about she lulls him, or he falls asleep and she cuts his hair. And then he loses his strength. And the Philistines come in, they gouge his eyes out, they capture him and cart him off. And at the and good enough for Samson, hair has this habit most of the time of growing back. Not all the time, but some of the time it will grow back. And Samson's hair grew back. He got his strength back, right? And at the end of the story, this is what we read. When he gets his strength back, he goes and He grasped the pillars, right, where there's some 3,000 Philistines. And Samson grasped, this is chapter 16, verse 29. Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested. He leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one, his left hand on the other. And when Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines," he strained with all of his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He judged Israel for 20 years. So in the moment of his death, Samson actually accomplishes the mission, so to speak, right? And I think this is something really important for us, is that we know at the beginning of the story, we know what the mission is: deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. We know what the end of the story is that he uses his strength to bring the temple down on the Philistines, and sort of in that way, delivers the people from the supremacy of the Philistines, right? So in his death, he more or less fulfills, in part, if not all, of the mission for what he was set out to do when he was born. But in the middle is all of this kind of bizarre stuff, right? It's just the stuff of life, of Samson kind of wandering and meandering around and being involved in this intrigue and that intrigue. But in the end, he winds up doing what it is that God wanted him to do in the first place. And the thing that's interesting about that, and I think the thing that's encouraging about that to us, is that God's will is going to be done one way or the other, right? God's ability to bring God's purposes to fruition is greater than our ability to mess it up. And being able to trust God to work through us and work through other people, even in the midst of a mess, is really powerful. Because truth be told, most of us are kind of a mess, right? I'm a mess, right? I mean, there are days when you've had days like this too, when it's like, God, I am so messed up, there is no way you're not using me today. I'm just not fit, right? But yet Samson's story points us in a different direction. And not only does Samson's story point us in a different direction than that attitude, but Hebrews recalling Samson as one who was one of the heroes of faith also helps us, right, to see that we don't have to be perfect or even close to it for God to accomplish the purposes that he has for us, right? You know that verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, right? God has created good works in advance that we should walk in them, right? That's a really great starting place. I think, I know I need to be reminded of that all the time, that God has a reason, multiple reasons, for me to be here and for you to be here. God has reasons for us. And even if we're not sure what those reasons are, that doesn't prevent God from working. And so there's a few things that I wanted to call our attention to tonight, just to remind us of that. The first one is that God is able to use us despite character flaws and weaknesses. One of the things I really love about the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and it's one of the reasons why when I was doing starting my seminary and graduate work in textual study, one of the reasons I chose the Old Testament for my concentration was that I started finding myself on every page. And as I was reading the stories, I was just beginning to see real people, right? I wasn't reading about perfect people. I was reading about people who struggled with real human emotions and drama, just like I struggled with, and yet God still used them, right? And one of the things that I, kind of assimilated from a lot of the lessons I had heard growing up was that, and I'm not saying anyone said this, but it was something that I absorbed, was that somehow you needed to be really good and almost perfect for God to use you. And I began to see that, God uses lots and lots and lots of imperfect people, right? I remember the first time I actually read the entire story of Noah. It blew my mind because somehow I'd missed that last part. The part after the ark. It's the part where Noah's drunk in the tent. That somehow doesn't make it to the flannel graph. That's not a part of the story that we're fond of telling, but it is very much a part of the story of Noah, who is all the way through Scripture is a righteous man. I mean, a man who was worthy of, and his family was worthy of God's saving, but he wasn't perfect. He was intensely human, right? Read stories about Abraham, right? The man of faith, right? But yet, we have to read when you're actually reading Genesis 12 to 25, we have to, it takes us a while to get to the faithful part because, he's sort of lying about his wife. He buys into Sarah's ruse, in order to have a child. He doesn't seem to protest when Hagar comes onto the scene. He's has this thing going on with, this protest going on with Lot and the whole thing with Sodom. I mean, there's things about Abraham that are problematic, but yet he's a faithful man because he believes God. David, another famous example, right? Man after God's own heart, yet has the affair with Bathsheba. And there's just person after person after person that we read about who are otherwise faithful, but in terms of their character, they're just like all of us. They struggle, right? And they have weaknesses. And one of the things that I think is part of our faith journey is to trust God to use us even when we fall. That God is able to act and use us over and above even when we make mistakes. That doesn't stop God from using us and from us being part still of his purpose. The second thing is that God uses us despite our lack of clarity on the purpose. There's not very much in the story of Samson that actually helps us understand that Samson knew why he was on earth. There's not a lot. We know as readers why he's here because we're reading the story. But if we kind of put ourselves back sort of real time into Samson's story, his parents probably know why he's here, but there's not very much that helps us understand that Samson had a full clarity on why he was here. And if I were to look at my own life, if I were to ask you, do you have absolute clarity on your reason for being here? I mean, do you know exactly every way in which God is going to use you? I think we'd have a whole variety of answers, right? In my years of ministry in New Jersey, this would come up, and I'm sure it comes up here, but it came up all the time. It's like, what is God's purpose for my life, right? And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that just because we don't really know what it is, that God must not know what it is, right? But God does know right? That passage in Ephesians, he created good works in advance that we should walk in them. God knows why each one of us tonight is here. He knows how he wants to use us. And I think if we could sort of pull back the veil and see everything that God sees, we would be amazed at the ways in which God has already used each one of us, right? And so just because we're not completely clear on it doesn't mean that God isn't working in our lives. And, you know, if we were to be able to go back into the Hebrew Scripture and we were to be able to have conversations with each of the people that we now regard as heroes of faith, I'm not sure that they would have necessarily known at every particular point in time all the ways in which their lives were impacting others around them and how their stories were continuing thousands of years later to impact us. And so again, you know, it strengthens our faith to be able to read these stories and to see we don't have to have clarity. We don't have to be crystal clear for God to be able to use us. A third one that's kind of related to that is God uses us despite even our misunderstanding of his purpose or our purpose, right? Which is kind of related to a lack of clarity. But Samson didn't really know how he was going to deliver Israel from the Philistines, right? There was no plan, right? There was no sequence that we read about that Samson was going to do this and he was going to do this and then he was going to do that, and at the end of that the Philistines would be delivered. There's nothing like that in the story. In fact, the story itself meanders around and you don't know what's going to happen on the next page, right? This story goes from him marrying a Philistine woman to then telling riddles to the Philistines, and then the Philistines being upset because they don't understand the riddle and they want his wife to explain the riddle, and then she doesn't want to explain the riddle and she gets upset with Samson. I mean, it's a soap opera, really. You know, for a few chapters, just wanders all over the place. And then he meets, you know, Delilah, and then there's this intrigue with his hair, and then it goes, you know, his eyes are gouged out and, you know, all this gore. And then in the end, all the Philistines die. So it's like, wow, that's pretty neat. I mean, you know, how it kind of all works out in the end, but you have no idea how you get there, right, from the beginning. You can't, you know, you can't write this kind of stuff, right? It's just the way it worked. And I think our lives are like that too, right? There's a kind of going through life, and hopefully our lives are more ordered than Samson's are, but a lot of times it's not. You know, just life happens to us in ways that we can't predict, right? And if you were to be writing your story, I mean, you already know that there's a lot of places in life that haven't really worked out quite the way you thought they might, or maybe there's things that have happened to you that you would have never dreamed would have happened to you. Or there's things that have happened to people that you know that would have never been on your radar to think that this could happen to person A, B, or C. And so there is this kind of wandering through life that we can experience, but even that does not dissuade or deter or trouble God from accomplishing God's purposes, right? God is bigger than all of that. And sometimes I like to think of kind of visually think of God as a constant, right? God is up here, right? And God is watching over all that we do. Now, our lives are not like this. They're kind of like this, right? I mean, they're just bouncing all over the place, right? But even though he's with us, God is not on our roller coaster, right? And God is able, because he's God, to make things work out in a way that is in accordance with his plan and purpose, and it's okay if we don't understand exactly how all that works. In fact, that's a great place to relax spiritually is to not is to recognize that there's things we're not going to know, and let that be okay. Right? To let God be God and let us be human, and to know that God loves us, he cares about us, he's with us, he knows what needs to happen, he's going to get us there. And trust that, right? I think that's what Hebrews is really talking about. You know, when it says without faith, it's what? Impossible to please God, right? God, the goal is to hang on to God, right? It's even when our intellect fails, even when we don't understand, even when things are so upside down that it doesn't seem like anything will be put right again. It's to hang on to God in those moments. Just hang on, right? Because God's going to get what needs to be done. And learning to trust that, I don't think that's something, at least in my life, and maybe in your life, it's this way too, that it's not something that you learn once. I have to learn this over and over and over and over again, right? Right? Each situation teaches us something new about how to hang on, right? How to trust. And that's really that's even the preface to the Hebrew writer listing all of these people of faith, right? Is they hung on, they didn't give up. They hung in there. The other one is that God is able to get us where we need to be. God is able to conquer or to accomplish his purposes for us, even in the midst of great pain. Right? And by pain, I mean things that we go through that are, adversity. It can be emotional pain. It can be physical pain, psychic pain. It can be financial loss. I mean, all these things that happen to us. God is able to use us even then, right? And you know how pain works, right? I mean, this is something about pain. Pain takes you over, and you can't think about anything else when you're in pain, right? A toothache will prove that. You have a toothache, you have the slightest little part of your body that goes wrong, you hurt where? All over. And other kinds of things that happen to us, we're in so much pain, that's all we can think about, right? We can't even, the pain can be so intense that sometimes we can't even pray, right? Can't pray. Can't even think about God. Don't even want to hear about God. Don't even want to come to church. It's too bad. We just can't do it anymore, right? God can work even there. There is nothing that God cannot work through. And I think that is the message that we take from Samson, right? Is that the moment at which Samson actually accomplished the mission, he couldn't see anything. He didn't have any eyes, right? It was at that moment that he was calling on God's strength to, let me do what I'm supposed to do. It didn't actually happen until probably one of the most pain-filled moments of his entire life. And it was his last. But God's work was still done, right? And that to me is really the takeaway, is that whatever it is kind of in our life right now that is maybe we're letting it cloud and make us wonder if we're worth it, or if God's really going to use us, or if we have value, the answer is yes. We are valuable to God, and he is going to use us. Amen? Amen. Thank you.